Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we uncover a sinister conspiracy that intertwines organized crime and human desperation, a chilling tale of exploitation, greed, and untold human suffering. This is the story of the Mafia's role in the migrant crisis. A story of power, control, and unimaginable cruelty. It will leave you questioning how far criminals will go in pursuit of profit. How could a shadowy underworld thrive on the backs of those seeking refuge and safety? Stay with us as we delve deep into the dark and tragic reality of how the Mafia profits from human suffering. In the shadows of a global humanitarian crisis, a sinister empire thrives. Behind the headlines of overcrowded boats and desperate refugees lies a dark underworld, where human lives are currency and suffering fuels unimaginable wealth. What if the true architects of this crisis weren't politicians or warlords, but the Mafia pulling the strings and profiting from every tragedy? This is the untold story of how organized crime turned desperation into a billion-dollar enterprise. And the deeper we dig, the darker it gets. The story begins in the waters of the Mediterranean, where waves of desperation collide with the relentless pursuit of survival. Overcrowded boats, barely seaworthy, carry migrants fleeing the horrors of war, persecution, and crushing poverty. Each vessel is a fragile beacon of hope for the men, women, and children aboard, but their journey is not just shaped by their resolve or by the dangers of the sea. Lurking behind the scenes is a cold and calculated machine of exploitation, one that thrives on the very despair it claims to assist. Amal, a 28-year-old teacher from Syria, is one of thousands who have entrusted their lives to smugglers. After losing her family and her home to years of conflict, her hope lies in reaching Europe, where she dreams of starting anew. Like so many others, she places her trust in a network of individuals who promise safety, but she doesn't realize that her escape is controlled by forces far more sinister. The smugglers who took her money and arranged her journey are merely pawns in a much larger game. Behind the scenes lies the Calabrian Ndrangheta, one of the most powerful and ruthless criminal syndicates in the world. Over decades, they have built an empire on drugs, extortion, and weapons trafficking. But in recent years, they have expanded their operations into an even more lucrative industry, human trafficking. For them, the migrant crisis is not a tragedy but a booming business, and Amal is just another transaction. The Mafia's control extends to every aspect of the migrant's journey. They fund and oversee the smuggling networks that transport people across dangerous waters. Local fishermen, struggling to make ends meet, are coerced into piloting overcrowded boats under threat of violence. For every person crammed onto a vessel, the Mafia collects a profit, treating human lives as commodities to be bought, sold, and discarded. Amal's boat is one such vessel. It is old, leaky, and barely holds the 80 people packed on board. The smugglers assure the passengers it will hold up long enough to reach European shores, but what they don't say is that the boat's condition is deliberate. If the vessel sinks, it becomes a tragedy that draws international attention and prompts humanitarian aid that the Mafia has already positioned itself to collect. This is part of a larger scheme. The Ndrangheta has infiltrated international charities and NGOs, setting up fake humanitarian organizations to absorb donations and government funding. While the world mourns the loss of lives at sea, the Mafia launders millions through these shell operations, expanding their reach and deepening their pockets. Every sinking boat, every tragic headline, becomes another opportunity for profit. Amal, along with the others on board, clings to the hope that their journey will end in safety. But the reality of what awaits is far darker. The Mafia's reach doesn't end at the shoreline. Migrants who survive the treacherous crossing are often funneled into detention centers that the Mafia controls through corrupt deals with local officials. For those who refuse to comply or who cannot pay further bribes, the consequences can be devastating. Amal is unaware of this grim fate as her journey continues, but the signs are already there. The crew operating her boat appears nervous and evasive, their fear evident as they glance at the horizon. These are not the actions of people intent on fulfilling a promise of safe passage. They are the movements of men caught in a web of threats and violence. As the sun dips below the horizon, Amal looks out at the endless expanse of water, unaware of the shadowy forces steering her destiny. She is a pawn in a game she cannot see, one controlled by men like Enrico Bianchi. a shadowy figure who orchestrates these operations with ruthless precision. From his luxurious estate in Calabria, Enrico ensures that every boat, every bribe, and every life is accounted for. The stage is set for tragedy. The sea, already dangerous, becomes a battleground where human desperation meets cold-blooded greed. Amal's journey is just beginning, but the forces working against her are already moving pieces into place. What lies ahead is a story of betrayal, exploitation, and unimaginable cruelty, a story that begins with hope and ends with a terrifying descent into the underworld. Enrico Bianchi sat at the center of a sprawling web of crime. Known as the Broker, he was the mastermind behind the human trafficking arm of the Calabrian 'Ndrangheta. Unlike many of his counterparts who reveled in violence, Enrico thrived on precision. He managed the operation like a corporate empire, ensuring that every migrant, every boat, and every bribe fit seamlessly into his larger scheme. His ability to blend ruthlessness with strategy had earned him his position at the top, and under his leadership, the Mafia had transformed the Migrant Crisis into a billion-dollar enterprise. From his estate in Calabria, Enrico directed a vast network of smugglers, recruiters, and corrupt officials. Each link in the chain was essential. Fishermen along the North African coast were paid, and often threatened, to pilot the unseaworthy boats. Middlemen collected exorbitant fees from desperate migrants, promising safe passage but delivering them into treacherous waters instead. The system ran efficiently, and with each successful crossing, the Mafia's coffers swelled. But Enrico's empire wasn't built on logistics alone. To maintain control, he relied on Luca Mancini, his enforcer and right-hand man. Luca was a figure who inspired both fear and loyalty among those who worked beneath him. He was the one who ensured silence through intimidation. If a fisherman dared to refuse a job or a smuggler pocketed too much of the profits, Luca was sent to make an example of them. His methods were brutal, but they were effective. Few were willing to cross the Mafia after encountering him. As Amal's journey continued across the Mediterranean, the boat she traveled on creaked ominously with every wave. Unbeknownst to her and the others, the dangers they faced were no accident. The Mafia's strategy relied on desperation and risk. If the migrants survived, the profits flowed. If they didn't, the tragedy would generate sympathy, fueling donations and aid programs that the Mafia had already infiltrated. Either outcome was a win for Enrico and his operation. Luca monitored the journey from a distance, ensuring that no unforeseen disruptions interfered with the plan. The Mafia's influence extended even to European waters, where certain Coast Guard officials, lured by bribes, turned a blind eye to the smuggling routes. This level of corruption allowed the 'Ndrangheta to operate with near impunity. On land, the syndicate's reach went further still. Enrico had established a network of detention centers across Italy, ostensibly to house intercepted migrants. In reality, these centers were part of the same machinery of exploitation. Managed by companies tied to the Mafia, the centers received millions in government funding. The funds, however, rarely translated into actual care for the migrants. Instead, the facilities were overcrowded, with minimal resources and inhumane conditions. These centers served a dual purpose. They provided the Mafia with a legitimate front to launder their profits, while also acting as a holding pen for migrants who could be exploited further. Those who couldn't pay additional bribes to secure their freedom were at risk of being sold into forced labor or trafficking networks. Every individual who passed through these centers represented another opportunity for profit. Amal remained unaware of these darker layers as her boat edged closer to European waters. The journey had already taken a physical and emotional toll. The passengers were weak, dehydrated, and terrified. But for Amal, hope still flickered faintly in the distance. She believed that land would bring safety, not realizing she was moving from one trap to another. Back in Calabria, Enrico's operation was running smoothly, but cracks were beginning to form. A whistleblower had leaked information about irregularities in one of the Mafia-controlled charities. Although the leak was minor, it was enough to make Enrico cautious. He ordered Luca to tighten security and eliminate any potential threats. For Enrico, the success of his empire depended on secrecy, and he would stop at nothing to maintain it. As Amal's boat finally approached the European coastline, her journey seemed to be reaching its conclusion. But in reality, it was only the beginning of a much darker chapter. The Mafia's grip extended beyond the sea, and for Amal and others like her, the horrors of their journey were far from over. For Enrico, the incoming wave of migrants meant only one thing: another opportunity to expand his empire of suffering. Amal's journey, which she had hoped would lead to freedom, ended in the grim confines of a detention center in Sicily. The center was overcrowded, with hundreds of migrants packed into tight quarters. The smell of damp air and unwashed bodies permeated the space, and the air buzzed with muffled cries and whispers. Amal, like many others, was disoriented and exhausted, unsure of what would happen next. The detention center was one of many scattered across Italy, funded by government grants and international aid. On paper, these centers were designed to provide temporary shelter for migrants while their cases were processed. In reality, they were yet another cog in the Mafia's sprawling machine of exploitation. Through carefully constructed layers of shell companies and corrupt intermediaries, Enrico Bianchi had ensured that a significant portion of the funds allocated to these centers flowed directly into his accounts. Matteo Rossi, a young social worker employed at the center, had begun to notice troubling patterns. On the surface, he tried to do his job, providing what little comfort he could to the migrants. But beneath his professional demeanor, Matteo was growing increasingly uneasy. The official reports didn't match the reality he saw every day. Millions of euros were supposedly allocated to food, clothing, and medical supplies, yet the conditions in the center were deplorable. Supplies ran out far too quickly, and the migrants were left with the bare minimum to survive. Matteo's suspicions deepened when he noticed certain migrants being escorted out of the center late at night. These individuals were never seen again, their names quietly removed from the records. When he questioned his colleagues, he was met with vague responses or warnings to stay quiet. But Matteo couldn't ignore the growing pile of evidence. He began documenting everything: discrepancies in financial records, the sudden disappearances, and the unusual movements of certain staff members. Unbeknownst to Matteo, his actions had not gone unnoticed. The Mafia's presence within the center was subtle but pervasive. Luca Mancini, ever watchful, had placed informants within the staff to ensure loyalty and silence. When Matteo started asking too many questions, Luca was alerted. For someone like Luca, who had spent years enforcing the Mafia's dominance through fear and violence, Matteo's curiosity was a loose thread that needed to be cut. Meanwhile, Amal began to piece together fragments of the grim reality around her. She had hoped the detention center would be a stepping stone to a new life, but the longer she stayed, the clearer it became that the system was designed to trap her. Through whispered conversations with other migrants, Amal learned of people being taken away under mysterious circumstances. Some were rumored to have been sold into forced labor, while others were sent to brothels or factories controlled by the Mafia. One day, Amal overheard guards negotiating with an unknown figure in hushed tones. She couldn't make out all the details, but the words she caught confirmed her fears. The migrants weren't just detainees, they were products, bartered and sold to the highest bidder. Amal realized that if she didn't find a way out, she might never leave. Matteo's investigation took a dangerous turn when he stumbled upon a stack of invoices tied to a charitable organization that was supposedly providing aid to the center. The organization's name was unfamiliar, but after some digging, Matteo discovered it was registered to a dummy corporation linked to Enrico Bianchi. The evidence was damning, but Matteo knew it wasn't enough. He needed to connect the dots to the Mafia's broader operations. As Matteo delved deeper, the risks escalated. Luca Mancini ordered his men to keep a closer watch on him, subtly reminding the young social worker that stepping out of line could have severe consequences. Matteo tried to stay discreet, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Amal, too, began plotting her own escape. She befriended Leila, another detainee who had been in the center longer and had a better understanding of its workings. Together, they started gathering information and identifying the vulnerabilities in the center's security. Amal knew time was running out, the rumors of disappearances were becoming more frequent, and she feared she might be next. As Matteo prepared to reach out to an investigative journalist with the evidence he had collected, he noticed a black car parked outside his apartment. He tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but the sinking feeling in his chest told him otherwise. In the detention center, Amal clutched a piece of paper on which she had written her story, her journey, the horrors of the detention center, and the faces of those who had disappeared. She needed to get it into the hands of someone who could expose the truth, but doing so would mean risking everything. Both Amal and Matteo found themselves on the precipice of danger, unaware that their actions had set off a chain reaction. In the shadows, Luca Mancini prepared to silence any threat to Enrico Bianchi's empire, and the noose tightened around those who dared to challenge the Mafia's grip on the migrant crisis. Amal's plan to escape the detention center was fraught with danger. Every corner seemed to hold a pair of watchful eyes, and every sound in the dead of night set her heart racing. The center was a maze of high fences, patrolling guards, and locked doors, all designed to keep people like her trapped. But Amal was determined. Along with Layla, her newfound ally, she had identified a small opening in the perimeter fence near the supply area. It wasn't much, but it was their only hope. What Amal didn't know was that the detention center was under heightened surveillance. Luca Mancini had received word of whispers among the detainees, rumors of defiance and escape. He had no tolerance for such risks. Amal and Layla were unaware that their movements were being subtly monitored, and the closer they got to executing their plan, the more precarious their situation became. In another part of Italy, Matteo Rossi was on edge. He had gathered enough evidence to expose the Mafia's control over the detention centers, but he knew the danger he faced. The black car that had appeared outside his apartment was a clear warning. He had started receiving anonymous phone calls, silent at first, then filled with veiled threats. Matteo understood that if he didn't act quickly, the evidence he had painstakingly collected might never see the light of day. Matteo decided to contact Sofia Conti, a seasoned investigative journalist known for her fearless reporting on organized crime. Sofia had spent years uncovering the dark underbelly of Italy's criminal networks, and Matteo knew she would be the only person who could bring his findings to the public. But reaching out to her was a risk. The Mafia had eyes everywhere, and even a single misstep could cost him his life. As Matteo prepared to meet Sofia in a remote location, Luca Mancini's men closed in. Matteo's movements had been tracked, and Luca had no intention of letting him reveal what he knew. Luca didn't need to act immediately. He was patient, calculating. He wanted to see if Matteo would lead him to anyone else who might be part of the growing threat to the operation. Back in the detention center, Amal and Layla made their move. They waited until the early hours of the morning, when the guards were less alert. Quietly, they slipped out of their overcrowded dormitory and made their way to the supply area. Amal's heart pounded in her chest as they approached the fence. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, felt like an alarm signaling their escape. As they reached the gap in the fence, Amal felt a fleeting sense of hope. But just as Layla started to crawl through, the sound of heavy footsteps shattered the silence. A beam of light swept across the yard, and Amal froze. The guards were closer than they had anticipated, and escape seemed impossible. But Layla whispered a desperate plea for Amal to keep going. Layla pushed Amal forward and stayed behind, creating a distraction that drew the guards away. Amal didn't look back. She ran into the darkness, her feet pounding against the cold earth, her mind filled with fear for Layla. She didn't know if her friend would make it out alive, but she knew she had to keep moving. Amal's escape set off a chain reaction in the detention center. Luca Mancini was alerted immediately, and he wasted no time in escalating the situation. For Luca, Amal's disappearance was more than an inconvenience, it was a threat to the secrecy of their operations. Meanwhile, Matteo met Sofia in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He handed her a folder filled with documents, photos, and handwritten notes detailing the Mafia's control over the detention centers. Sofia was stunned by the scale of corruption and exploitation Matteo had uncovered. But before they could discuss the next steps, Sofia noticed a shadow moving outside the building. Matteo's instincts kicked in, and he knew they had been followed. He urged Sofia to leave through the back entrance, while he attempted to lead their pursuers away. Sofia hesitated, but Matteo's urgency convinced her to flee. As Matteo stepped outside, he saw two men approaching, their faces obscured by the dim light. He knew who they were and what they intended to do. Amal, now free from the detention center, found herself alone in a foreign land, with no clear direction. She clutched the piece of paper she had written her story on, determined to find someone who could help her expose the horror she had witnessed. But Amal's journey was far from over. The Mafia's reach extended far beyond the fences of the detention center, and her escape had made her a target. As Luca Mancini's men closed in on Matteo and Amal wandered the streets in search of safety, Enrico Bianchi remained confident in his empire's strength. But cracks had begun to appear, and the forces of resistance were gathering. In the shadows, a storm was brewing, and the lives of Amal, Matteo, and those caught in the web of exploitation were about to collide in ways none of them could predict. Amal wandered through the unfamiliar streets, cold and disoriented, her piece of paper clutched tightly in her hand. Every shadow seemed like a threat, every sound a warning. She had no idea where to go or who to trust, but her determination to expose the horrors she had endured kept her moving. The paper she carried wasn't just her story, it was evidence of the Mafia's control over the detention center and the suffering inflicted on countless others like her. She believed if she could get it into the right hands, perhaps she could make a difference. In Calabria, Enrico Bianchi was beginning to feel the weight of pressure. His empire had thrived for years on secrecy and intimidation, but cracks had started to form. Reports of a migrant's escape from the detention center had reached him, and Luca Mancini's updates about Matteo Rossi's activities added another layer of concern. While Luca assured him that everything was under control, Enrico couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed system was teetering on the edge of exposure. Luca, meanwhile, was methodical in his pursuit of Matteo. After the meeting with Sofia Conti, Matteo had gone into hiding, but Luca's men were relentless. Matteo knew it was only a matter of time before they found him. Despite the danger, Matteo's decision to hand over the evidence to Sofia had given him a sense of purpose. He knew Sofia would use her platform to reveal the truth, but he also understood the Mafia wouldn't let it happen without a fight. Sofia worked quickly, sifting through the documents Matteo had provided. She was horrified by the extent of the corruption and the calculated cruelty of the Mafia's operations. As she prepared her expose, she realized the story would be explosive, implicating not just the Mafia but also corrupt officials and complicit organizations. It was a story that could shake the foundations of power, but it came with a price. Sofia knew she was now a target, and she had to move carefully. Amal's journey eventually brought her to a small church on the outskirts of a bustling town. Exhausted and starving, she collapsed on the steps. The priest, a kind-hearted man named Father Angelo, found her and took her inside. He offered her food and warmth, and for the first time in weeks, Amal felt a glimmer of safety. She explained as much as she could about her story and the papers she carried, and Father Angelo, realizing the gravity of her situation, promised to help her. Through a network of activists he trusted, Father Angelo connected Amal with a local journalist who had ties to Sofia Conti. Amal didn't know it yet, but her story was about to become the missing piece in Sofia's investigation. The journalist carefully transported Amal's paper to Sofia, who immediately recognized its significance. Amal's first-hand account corroborated much of Matteo's evidence and added a human face to the atrocities being committed. Luca's pursuit of Matteo finally came to a head when his men cornered the young social worker in an abandoned farmhouse where he had been hiding. Matteo, unarmed and defenseless, faced Luca with a quiet resolve. He knew his life might end here, but he also knew the evidence was no longer in his possession. Sofia had it, and so did Amal. Whatever Luca did to him, the truth was already on its way to being exposed. As Matteo confronted his fate, Sofia published her expose. The story was released across multiple platforms, accompanied by harrowing photos, documents, and Amal's powerful testimony. It sent shockwaves through Italy and beyond, sparking outrage and calls for immediate action. The headlines named Enrico Bianchi as the mastermind behind the exploitation, linking him to corrupt officials and exposing the Mafia's grip on the migrant crisis. Enrico's empire began to crumble. Authorities, forced to act under immense public pressure, launched raids on detention centers and Mafia-controlled operations. Enrico, always careful to insulate himself, tried to disappear into the shadows, but his network of loyalists was unraveling. Luca Mancini, furious at how events had spiraled out of control, went into hiding as well, leaving behind a trail of chaos. Amal, now under the protection of activists, watched the fallout with a mix of relief and sadness. She had survived, but the scars of her journey would remain forever. Matteo's fate remained uncertain, but his sacrifice had not been in vain. Sofia's work had given a voice to those who had been silenced, and Amal's courage had helped expose the truth. As the dust began to settle, the world's attention turned to the ongoing migrant crisis and the systemic corruption that had fueled it. The Mafia's role had been laid bare, and while justice was far from complete, a glimmer of hope emerged for those still trapped in its grip. Amal, despite everything, found herself believing in that hope. She knew her journey was just one of many, but she hoped her story would inspire others to fight against the darkness. In the shadows, Enrico Bianchi planned his next move. For him, this was not the end, merely a setback, but the world was watching now, and the empire he had built on human suffering would never be the same. Thank you for watching Mystery Minds. If this story left you questioning the unseen forces shaping our world, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories that uncover the dark and hidden truths. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.